Have you ever watched a tiny, localized conflict just snowball into a massive global crisis seemingly overnight? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we are diving deep into the dizzying escalation between the US and Iran. We're going to break down the economics, the hard structural limits of military power, and what political scientist John Mearsheimer's latest analysis tells us about the whole shebang. $132 billion. Let that number sink in for a second. Originally, the Pentagon projected this conflict would cost about $29 billion. Then, they revised it up to $80 billion. But when you factor in the indirect costs, the sudden surges in food and fuel prices you're seeing, the true estimated cost to everyday consumers and taxpayers right now is hitting $132 billion. And guys, it's still rising. So how in the world did this crisis escalate so incredibly fast? To figure out how we got here, here is our roadmap. We're going to look at the tit-for-tat escalation, Gulf vulnerability, the global oil threat, military limits, some eerie echoes of Vietnam, and finally, the political endgame. Okay, let's dive right into part one, the tit-for-tat escalation. Things have been moving at an absolute breakneck pace. Back on June 17th, an MOU, or Memorandum of Understanding, was signed. It was a ceasefire agreement that Mearsheimer notes was essentially a victory for Iran, mostly because the moderates in Iran pushed to sign it while their hardliners were warning against trusting the US. But then, the whole thing just fell apart. The US challenged Iran's control over the Strait of Hormuz, attempting to open a US-dominated channel. Iran looked at that and saw a blatant violation of the MOU. By July 7th, daily tit-for-tat strikes began. Mid-July saw the tragic deaths of the 15th and 16th US service members in Jordan, which happened after the US moved assets there due to vulnerabilities in other spots. And by July 14th, the US totally scrapped the MOU and slammed a naval blockade right back into place. Which brings us to Section 2, vulnerability in the Gulf. And this brilliantly illustrates just how insanely vulnerable this region really is. See, the US began targeting Iranian civilian infrastructure, like desalination plants and power grids, while Iran instantly retaliated against similar targets in countries like Kuwait. And here's the catch. Nations in the Gulf rely almost exclusively on desalination just to survive. Kuwait gets 90% of its drinking water this way. Oman is at 86% and Saudi Arabia is at 70%. And all of these plants, they are right within range of Iranian missiles. If this infrastructure gets destroyed, it triggers an immediate, catastrophic humanitarian crisis. This gives Iran immense deterrence leverage, basically forcing Gulf states to frantically pressure Washington to halt strikes on civilian targets. Moving on to Section 3, the global oil threat. Now, you might be wondering, why hasn't the global economy just completely cratered yet? Originally, about 20 million barrels of oil flowed out of the Gulf every single day. Right now, because of a few specific workarounds, we're temporarily dodging a massive bullet. About 7 million barrels are still squeezing out through ports outside the contested Strait of Hormuz, specifically Yanbu in Saudi Arabia and Fujairah in the UAE. Add to that a highly unexpected 5 million barrel drop in Chinese oil demand, plus the 3 million barrels a day being pumped out of the already depleted U.S. strategic reserve. So these geographical and economic band-aids have kept the market afloat, for now. But if Iran decides to just shut down the Red Sea and those alternative ports, the domino effect is going to be devastating. I mean, we're already seeing the stress fractures, shortages of cooking oil in India, a lack of global fertilizer, and a depleted supply of helium, which is absolutely crucial for manufacturing microchips. Economists are sounding the alarm that if the strait remains contested and those alternative ports are shut down, we face the imminent risk of a global depression. This is exactly why this high-stakes geopolitical chess match matters to everyday consumers when they're just trying to buy groceries. Let's pivot to Section 4, limits of military power. It is honestly fascinating to look at the track record of recent military strategies here. The US tried this massive 40-day strategic air campaign from late February to early April, and it failed. It didn't neutralize Iran's missile and drone capabilities, but it sure did dangerously exhaust US munition stockpiles. After that didn't work, they tried a naval blockade, which also failed and eventually led to the June 17th MOU. Now, that exact same blockade has been reimposed, but with basically zero new coercive leverage. Oh, and it's super important to note that Israel is intentionally sitting this current tit-for-tat cycle out. They learned from that 40-day air campaign that Iranian missiles absolutely can penetrate defenses, and they do not want to become a giant magnet for retaliation. So, with air power and naval power both coming up short, we really have to ask the elephant in the room. Does the U.S. actually have a viable ground option to force a resolution? The answer is 8,000.
While you might hear on the news that there are 50,000 U.S. troops in the region, Mearsheimer points out that the vast majority are not combat troops. There are, at the absolute maximum, 8,000 Army infantry and Marines ready for an operation. Let's put that into perspective. Contrast that tiny number with the reality of Iran, a massive country with forbidding mountainous terrain, a formidable military, and a population of 93 million people. A land invasion with just 8,000 troops, it's simply not a serious military option.
And making matters vastly more complicated is the sheer sophistication of Iran's arsenal right now. We're not just talking about unguided rockets. Iranian ballistic missiles are highly maneuverable as they descend, allowing them to dodge advanced defense systems like the Patriot batteries. On top of that, they're being guided by excellent, precise satellite intelligence provided by China and Russia. They know exactly which specific pinpoint targets to hit. This deadly combo of maneuverability, accuracy, and top-tier foreign intelligence is neutralizing U.S. defense systems and rendering bases across Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan incredibly vulnerable. Basically, there's nowhere to hide.
Which takes us to Section 5, Echoes of Vietnam.
Mearsheimer draws a really stark, honestly chilling parallel to the Vietnam War here. He notes that if you took 5 of the smartest strategists back to March of 1965, they would have looked at the situation and told President Lyndon B. Johnson to get out immediately. Why? Because there was simply no theory of victory. Yet, policymakers often succumb to the temptation of escalation, hoping against hope that doubling down on force will magically solve the problem, even when they know behind closed doors that they completely lack a winning military strategy. And historically, we've seen exactly how this plays out. In March of 1965, LBJ began a heavy bombing campaign and deployed combat troops, fully aware of the severe limits of military force against the adversary. The escalation just continued blindly till March 1968, when LBJ, after deploying 530,000 troops to absolutely no avail, essentially quit. By the end of 1972, Nixon was forced to quit the war entirely. The current crisis is mirroring this exact trajectory. It's an imperial adventure rapidly escalating without being tethered to a coherent reality or a winnable military endgame.
Finally, let's zoom out to Section 6, the political endgame.
When we look at the domestic political chessboard, especially gearing up for the 2028 Republican presidential nomination, we see 2 wildly different maneuvers. On one side, you have J.D. Vance. He reportedly advised against the war and actually acted as the point man for the initial MOU negotiations. According to Mearsheimer, Vance recognizes the war is unwinnable and is pushing for a deal, basically accepting that the U.S. must walk away. But on the flip side, you have Marco Rubio. He is avoiding these negotiations entirely. Instead, Rubio is aligning very closely with domestic hawks and the Israel lobby, positioning himself strategically for 2028 by steering totally clear of a negotiated settlement that those factions oppose. It's a stark contrast in how domestic political survival can completely dictate foreign policy. Which leaves us with one massive, overriding question. Right now, Iranian hardliners are sitting in the driver's seat, holding immense leverage over global oil and regional water supplies. So what happens next? Are policymakers in Washington going to accept military reality, swallow a much tougher deal than that original MOU, and negotiate a settlement? Or will they double down, flailing for a military solution that literally doesn't exist, and risk plunging the entire world into an economic depression? It is a geopolitical chessboard with absolutely no easy moves left. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it helped map out the incredibly high stakes of this unfolding crisis. Catch you next time.